morning, morning, morning. Good morning. Good morning to you.
We're going to get started with His Excellency David Comissiong, Barbados Ambassador to CARICOM. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Tisha. Pleasure to be here.
It's wonderful to have you. Now, as I mentioned, the new Bridgetown agenda it comes off of a recent speech to the UN General Assembly that the Prime Minister made that we're going to be talking about this morning. And most importantly, the Prime Minister was talking about the need to repurpose the international institutions that were particularly established a few years ago to address problems that differ for today's problems. So let's talk about how the problems that exist today differ from years ago when these institutions were established and why we need to kind of advocate to have them changed.
Yes, thanks, Tisha. Well, first of all, the Bridgetown agenda was developed right here in Barbados around the end of July going into August, when a number of leading minds from civil society and academia from across the world came to Barbados and brainstormed. You know, the world is in a crisis. How do we need to go forward as an international community? And so Prime Minister Motley got the opportunity at the recent UN General Assembly to present the Bridgetown agenda to the world community, because these are ideas coming out of Barbados and the Caribbean that the world needs. If we are to solve new problems like climate change, the climate crisis, for example, if these institutions that were established in 1945, when most of the world were still colonies, if these institutions are to respond to the needs of the scores of developing countries that have now become actors on the world stage. So the Prime Minister laid out that vision in her speech to the UN.
And we must ask ourselves, therefore, whether the time has not come for a review of the settlement of the Bretton Woods institutions that no longer serve the purpose in the 21st century that they served in the 20th century, that they served when they were catering to a quarter of the nation states that are now members of this august institution. We ask ourselves whether the time has not come for our voices to act collectively to demand that through the boards of directors of the respective institutions. And why do I say so? The International Bank for Reconstruction and Development is really what the World Bank is. And maybe if we referred to that continuously, we would remind ourselves that the purpose of reconstruction and development must be appropriate to the century in which we live. And the century in which we live does not only demand of us the eradication of poverty, which remains a noble goal, but it demands of us equally the protection of global public goods. All of us in here have suffered as a result of the weakest of us being unable to rise to the occasion for the protection of public health. All of us in here now know what it is to be on the front line of the climate crisis.
The Prime Minister talked about the World Bank institutions in there and some of their responsibilities. Can we get into what she was asking for a bit more in depth in terms of what where their responsibilities should lie?
Yeah, but Tisha, in that clip, she's speaking about the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the IMF. But bear in mind, the Bridgetown agenda also targets informal institutions like the G20 and the G7 group of wealthy nations. And the Prime Minister also said, look, these institutions need to be reformed as well, because where is Africa? Where is Africa? Africa is not at the table. So G7, G20, you need to expand your membership to bring Africa, the African Union, to the table. So yes, so that's the basic idea is these institutions were established at a time when Africa and the Caribbean, we were still colonies, we were not at the table. So the Bridgetown agenda begins with that. That is the overarching idea. But then it goes on and says, look, even before we get into reforming these institutions, we have to deal with the current debt crisis that is facing scores of developing countries because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the shutting down in global supply chains, the war in Ukraine. Many, many countries are on the verge of a debt crisis. So the first plank of the Bridgetown agenda says we need emergency measures to help us out of this debt crisis. So, for example, it says to the IMF, you need to go back to the emergency measures you had put in place at the height of the COVID pandemic, making credit easily and unconditionally available to developing countries. IMF, you also need to rechannel US 100 billion in special drawing rights. These are foreign reserve assets that the IMF allocates to countries around the world. You need to take 100 billion of those assets that are not needed by big developing countries and reallocate them to small and struggling developing countries that desperately need them. And she's also said to the G20 and the G7, you need to intervene with the multilateral development banks to suspend for a period of time payments on loans that developing countries are struggling with at this point because of the debt crisis, and also middle income countries like Barbados, those COVID-related loans that we are struggling with. This is a time when we must begin this process of reform by dealing with the immediate debt crisis and easing it. So that's step one of the Bridgetown agenda.
And the Prime Minister also spoke more on that.
We believe today that the most appropriate place to deal with global public goods is in fact the World Bank Group. And I'll speak more to this tomorrow, but I want to simply say that if companies, multinational companies, have contributed to the global public risk or benefit from the solutions for global public goods, then they ought to contribute to their resolution through a small percentage of their profits, funding the needs of countries, whether it is in the issue of climate, stability and resilience and adaptation, whether it is for the protection of biodiversity both on land and in our waters, whether it is for the protection of public health against the next pandemic, the slow motion pandemic of antimicrobial resistance or others that we have not even contemplated, or the provision of education for each of our citizens, because to remain on this earth without the benefit of education is to be sentenced to life imprisonment from a young age. Or access to electricity, as 600 million people in Africa do without it. Or the equivalent to the right to knowledge and prosperity in our age, that is access to broadband. And of course, as I said to Congress last week, believe it or not, the right to a bank account, because countries across the world are being denied the right to access correspondent banking and leaving their citizens and their economies to function as financial pariahs in a world that is supposed to be globally interdependent for the movement of capital. My friends, the provision of that fund to promote public goods at a global level is critical if we are to make a difference going forward and to achieve the peace, the love, and the prosperity to which I referred.
I, yes, Tisha, she's referring to step 2 of the Bridgetown agenda. She's reminding the world that in 2015, the world agreed that we were going to pursue these 17 sustainable development goals, which is about eradication of poverty, food, shelter, education, healthcare, sanitation for human beings all across the world. And she's saying that these financial institutions now need to rise to the challenge at the scale that is necessary if mankind is going to achieve these goals by the year 2030. So step 2 of the Bridgetown agenda says to the international financial institutions, look, you need now to put together a fund of some US $1 trillion to make concessional loans to especially to developing countries to achieve these sustainable development goals. So this is the point. The developmental challenges facing the world today are on a much more massive scale than when these institutions were established years ago. So that is step 2, achieving the sustainable development goals for developing countries.
This is definitely a conversation we must continue, but it's a great start for us to start looking into the Bridgetown agenda and absolutely what's needed. We know that many of the reforms don't only require money, and you talked about the changes that need to be done. That starts with really dismantling the old order, how things were done before. How do you propose that we're going to be able to get this done, even past advocating at that level through the Prime Minister?
Well, let me also mention that the third step in the Bridgetown agenda then addresses the climate crisis. And the third step says, look, humanity is facing this existential crisis that can actually wipe us out. And we now need much more resources and finance to leverage, to direct towards solving the climate crisis. So the third step is calling for a new global institution to be established and to be financed at the level of 650 billion special drawing rights. Again, these are the assets that the IMF creates, and that global institution to be used if a country, for example, is hit by a climate disaster, for example, a hurricane. It should not have to be borrowing money to rebuild. That institution should be able to give it grants that it can rebuild. That institution should be able to give concessional financing to developing countries to make that transition to a low carbon society, to be able to adapt to global warming. And it should also be able to use those finances to drive private sector investment all over the world in adaptation to a low carbon societies, to drive the kind of investment that is going to be required if the world is actually going to come up to the challenge of putting those mitigation mechanisms in place to stop the global climate, the global temperatures rising to beyond 1.5 degrees by the end of this century. So this is a very ambitious agenda, but it is a very necessary agenda if we are going to preserve civilization, if people are going to live civilized lives in the rest of this 21st century, and if we are going to save the world from the existential threat of climate change. And now what Barbados wants is for all of CARICOM, all of our partners in the international community to mobilize around this Bridgetown agenda and make sure we get it implemented.
Well, thank you so much for sharing with us, Ambassador. Always insightful.
Thank you, Tisha. My pleasure.
Morning, morning.